Now let me read Acts chapter 9. I'm going to read the first 19 verses. Acts 9 and verse 1. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and he asked for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he may take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, and when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. In Damascus there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, "Ananias." "Yes, Lord," he answered. The Lord told him, "Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. In a vision he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight." "Lord," Ananias answered, "I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name." But the Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel. I'll show him how much he must suffer for my name." Then Ananias went to the house and entered it. Placing his hands on Saul, he said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit." Immediately something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. He got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. This is one of the most well-known, one of the most dramatic stories in the Bible. In fact, the term Damascus Road experience is an idiom for a total transformation in a person's life, a complete turnaround, 180-degree turn. And here is Saul of Tarsus, who has been the main enemy of the Church of Jesus Christ in its early days, is now transformed into becoming, in the course of time, its leading advocate and leading evangelist. It's a dramatic story, but something inside us probably says this is a very unfair story as well. Most people don't have this kind of dramatic encounter with God that leaves them with unmistakable evidence of his presence. Surely most people, if they could experience something like that, would surrender their lives to Christ, wouldn't they? You may be praying for somebody, maybe a friend, a relative, and if they could be going down the road and suddenly a bright light from the sky envelops them and they fall to the ground in response and they hear a voice calling their name. And they say, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm Jesus." Don't you think they will come to Christ too? In 1990, the British House of Lords debated an amendment to the broadcasting bill that would pave the way for humanism to be presented alongside Christianity in the public broadcasting of the BBC. And the man who moved the motion, a man called Lord Barron, and I happened to read this just a few days ago. In moving the motion, Lord Barron said, "I was brought up as a Methodist, but I lost my faith when I was 14. I went to the bottom of the garden and I said, 'If there is a God, please lift that garbage can lid.'" In English, he said, the rubbish bin. So I'll Canadianize it. "If there's a God, please lift that garbage can lid. Let the lid rise, and that will prove him to me." And Lord Barron went on to say, nothing happened to the garbage can lid. He then gave a few more plausible reasons for his atheism. But why didn't God lift the garbage can lid? And that would have shocked him, and would it have made him a believer? Wouldn't dramatic expressions of God's power prove himself to a skeptical world? Why does Paul have this advantage, or Saul of Tarsus have this advantage that many of us have not had? And not only that, it seems especially unfair when Saul of Tarsus was the main antagonist of the early Christian church. Surely then he was the least deserving of this kind of special encounter and special revelation of himself that God gave him. I mean, Saul has appeared before this event. He first appeared in chapter 7, verse 58, where there was the mob stoning of Stephen, who was the first martyr, and it says the witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. He was evidently too young to legally throw the stones himself, but he looked after the clothes of those who did and no doubt cheered them on. And as his body was crushed to death, it says in chapter 8, verse 1, Saul was there giving approval to his death. And the momentum that followed the stoning of Stephen was a mass movement of opposition against the church, and it was led by Saul of Tarsus. Chapter 8, verse 3 says, Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. And now here in chapter 9, verse 1, Saul is breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples, it says, and he receives permission to go to Damascus and bring back any Christians he can find as prisoners to Jerusalem. Later in Acts chapter 26, when Paul tells his own story, he says in verse 9 to 11 of Acts 26, I was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the saints in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. We only have the details of Stephen's martyrdom, but evidently there were others who were put to death in Jerusalem. I cast my vote against them, says Saul. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished. I tried to force them to blaspheme. In my obsession against them, I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. That's Saul telling his story years later. And he was on one of those missions to a foreign city, the city of Damascus, that he met the risen Christ. Getting near the city, this light enveloped him, and he fell to the ground and cried out, he heard a voice, first of all, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he responded, who are you, Lord? And he probably got the shock of his life when he heard the reply, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city. And Saul got up, found he was blind, remained blinded for 3 days, was led into Damascus. His companions heard the voice, but did not see anything, did not see the light that Saul had seen. And after 3 days of being in the state of blindness, a man called Ananias was sent by the Holy Spirit to Saul. And he prayed for him. His sins were washed away, it says. He received the Holy Spirit, and his sight was restored. It's a dramatic story. But the question I want to ask this morning is, what brings spiritual reality to one person like Saul, and yet not to another? Why do some people become converted to Christ, and other people don't? Why do some experience a dramatic conversion, yet others who may be very similar to them, maybe grown up in the same environment, even the same family, do not experience such a thing? I want to call what I have to share with you this morning the profile of a convert. Looking at this story to see what is the profile of a convert. What causes a person to come to Christ? And I want to point out from this story 3 things. about Saul that will resonate in the hearts of maybe many of you here today. Let me talk first of all about his inner condition. That is, his heart. There are some unobvious factors behind this story that we don't know about when we read it here in Acts chapter 9. As far as we know, this man is the arch enemy of Christ. What we see is a man who is angry, who is aggressive, who is murderous, who's an opponent of the church. But I ask the question, why was Paul that way? Why was he opposing the church? What lay behind his aggression? And the answer may surprise you. The answer is, he was trying to please God. Now, we know that because in Philippians chapter 3, Paul gave something of his testimony. And in verse 5 of that chapter, he says that he was of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in other words, a real Jew. In regard to the law, he says, I was a Pharisee, and as for zeal, I was persecuting the church. He's saying, my zeal for the law of God led me to persecute the church. You see, Saul was a committed Jew, and he did not take his commitment lightly. And he concluded this: if Judaism is right, then everything else which may threaten Judaism is by definition wrong. And therefore, if Judaism is right, anything which comes along which seeks to challenge it must itself be stopped. If the only way to stop it is to imprison those who lead it, or even to kill them, then imprison and kill them I will. And it was because he was zealous for the law of God, he tells us. Now, it was done in sincerity. He was sincerely wrong, of course, but Saul says he was genuinely seeking to please God. Now, Jesus said something very interesting about that earlier in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 and 8. He said, ask, and it will be given you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds, and to him who knocks, the door will be opened. Now, this is a fact of spiritual life, according to Jesus. Those who seek, find. Those who ask, receive. Those who knock, the door is opened to them, said Jesus. The only people who never receive, therefore the people who never ask, the only folks who never find are the people who never seek. The only people to whom the door stays closed are those who never knock. But let me ask you a question. What if you're asking for the wrong thing? Or you're seeking in the wrong direction, or you're knocking on the wrong door, but you are nevertheless asking and seeking and knocking? Well, this is what happens if you are genuinely asking, though for the wrong thing, God will give you the right thing. If you're genuinely seeking, though for the wrong thing, he'll lead you to the right thing. If you're knocking on the wrong door, genuinely seeking and knocking, he'll open the right door. And Saul was looking in the wrong direction. He was knocking on the wrong door. But God knew his heart and opened the right door and took him in the right direction. Many years earlier, God had said to Samuel in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7, he said, the Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance. That's, of course, what we see. But the Lord looks at the heart. And when the Christians looked at this man, Saul of Tarsus, all they saw was the outward appearance of a man who was their enemy, who was vitriolic, who was angry, who was destructive, who was murderous. So much so that the early church, when Saul was converted, did not believe he had been converted. Because later in the same chapter, chapter 9, verse 26, when Saul came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. They thought, this can't be. He's trying to infiltrate our numbers, find out who the real leaders are, that he can use that information to attack us and imprison them and maybe kill them. They didn't believe, it says at first, that he really was a disciple. But God does not look as man looks. Man looks on the outward appearance. There was no evidence of what was going on in Saul's heart at that point. God looks at the heart, and he saw a man who was hungry to please God, even though he was misinformed about what that would mean. You see, I believe we can say, on the basis of those words of Jesus, ask, it'll be given, seek, and you'll find, knock, the door will be open. I believe we can say that no one can say, I want to find God, but can't. For when you seek, you find. And this may explain two things. Firstly, why some people come to Christ suddenly and dramatically, and we had no clue that this conversion might come about, as in the case of Saul of Tarsus. The reason is because they were seeking for God, even though they did not know how they should seek for him. They may have been seeking in the wrong direction, but as they seek for him, he reveals himself to them. The second thing it may explain for us is why some people can be exposed to the gospel again and again, maybe brought up in a Christian environment, maybe in a Christian home, maybe participate in a Christian church, maybe even attend week after week, but never find spiritual life and reality. And there are many folks, and maybe there's one or two here this morning, and you're here because it's Sunday morning, you set your alarm to be here this morning, because it's what you do on a Sunday morning, but when it's over, and it's routine. But there's no real encounter with God in your daily experience, because you're not seeking for him. God said to Jeremiah 29 verse 13, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. And I suggest to you that the measure of our satisfaction with God is relative to the measure of our hunger for God. As we hunger for God, we become satisfied with God. If we don't hunger for God, you'll never know that satisfaction that he alone can meet in the deepest recess of your heart and soul. But how did Paul come to be seeking? In Psalm 53, the psalmist says there in verse 2 that God looks down from heaven on the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. God is looking, are there any who are seeking me? And then the psalm goes on to say that actually there are none who are seeking after God. Paul himself stated that when he wrote his letter to the Romans in chapter 3 and verse 11. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. So how does it come about that Saul of Tarsus is seeking, as we can conclude he is, for God? Well, clearly if no one seeks God naturally, there has to be a divine initiative that is taking place. Now, Jesus said about the Holy Spirit that the wind blows where it will. We hear its sound. We don't know where it comes from, where it's going. There is this sovereignty, this unpredictability about the work of the Holy Spirit. That is true. But something has taken place which has awakened in this heart and soul of Saul of Tarsus a hunger, a zeal to please God. Now, are there any recognizable factors that may have contributed to this? I mean, was it through listening to good preaching, for instance? Because we know that Saul of Tarsus listened to Stephen's brilliant message in Acts chapter 7. Well, I have absolutely no doubt that God does use preaching to awaken people's hearts. He does, as the Spirit speaks to people through that means. But Saul of Tarsus, having listened to Stephen, found his antagonism had been fueled by Stephen's message. It was that which precipitated this mass opposition to the church, which Saul spearheaded. Now, I do believe that Stephen's message did penetrate because of later things which happened in Paul's ministry, which is so akin to what Stephen had said in his message. I think we find a clue in Romans chapter 16, This is the last chapter of the book of Romans, and it's not one you read very often, because Paul basically is giving a list of greetings to people that he knew in Rome. And here's an interesting comment in verse 7 of Romans 16. He says, "Greet Andronicus and Junius, my relatives, who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was." Notice two important things there about these two people, Andronicus and Junius. First of all, he says they were my relatives. Secondly, he says they were in Christ before I was. We don't know what the relationship was, whether they were cousins, it's a male and a female, whether they were a brother-in-law and sister-in-law, or uncle and aunt, or whatever they may have been, we don't know. But they were relatives, and here's the intriguing thing, they were Christians, says Paul, before I was. Now, if they were relatives of Saul, and they were Christians before Saul was, presumably, back in Jerusalem, we don't know anything about them, we can only speculate, but perhaps converted back in Jerusalem. Maybe on the day of Pentecost, we don't know. When this opposition came against the church led by Saul of Tarsus, what do you think his relatives were doing? I'll tell you what they were almost certainly doing. They were praying for him. When they'd meet and they'd say, the big enemy is Saul of Tarsus, they'd say, he's our relation, he's our relative. You can be sure they were praying for him. Actually, it's interesting to explore some of Paul's relatives. He has 8 relatives in the New Testament that figure. Not just Andronicus and Junius in Romans 16, but in Romans 16 verse 11 he says, "Greet Herodian, my relative." And in verse 21 he says, "Lucius, Jason, and Sosipater, my relatives." There are 6 people he mentions in Rome who are his relatives, who are Christians. Some of them before he was, maybe not all of them, but some of them before he was. And then in Acts 23, we meet Paul's sister and her son, Paul's nephew, and he is in prison in Jerusalem, and they try to help him in his imprisonment. They're evidently Christians at this stage. Maybe they've been Christians for a long while too. We don't know enough about that. But I would suggest to you this, that as their relatives who were Christians before he was, they were praying for him. There's no evidence the apostles were praying for him, because when he did become a Christian, they didn't say, "Hallelujah, this is an answer to prayer." They didn't believe it. Maybe they were tempted to think that he was beyond the pale. But we can be pretty sure his relatives were. Now, prayer is not an exact science. You cannot say this much prayer equals this result. But we do know, because Scripture tells us, that we have not because we ask not. And we do know that our intercession does open up a line into people's hearts from heaven. And although I cannot prove this beyond speculating on the information we have, I would suggest that the intercession on Saul's behalf by those of his relatives, at least who were Christians, was part of the awakening that was taking place in his heart. That's why our intercession is so important. As we ask God to create in people's hearts a hunger and an appetite for himself. But I want to say to you this morning, if you're not hungry for God, or you're watching on television today, and you're not hungry for God, but you've turned on and you're watching today because deep down in your heart there's a stirring, would you ask God to lead you to finding him as you seek him? And if you say, "I don't hunger for God," would you say, "God, please make me hungry to be hungry, to long to find him"? And God knew Saul's heart, knew he was seeking, and chose his moment to reveal himself on the Damascus road. But why this moment? Well, that leads to my second point in this profile of a convert. The first factor was his inner condition. The second factor, I suggest, is his outer position. Let me explain what I mean by this. It's very interesting to me that Saul met Christ on the Damascus road. Why did he not meet Christ in Jerusalem? where he was living at the time, or in Tarsus, which was his home, from which he'd come. Why did God meet him on the Damascus road, on territory we assume he'd never been on before? I want to suggest to you that God took him away from his home environment to meet with him in a way that God frequently does in Scripture. I could give you a number of instances, and there are many more. Abraham, who came from Ur of the Chaldees, and God said, leave Ur of the Chaldees, go to a land I'll show you when you get there. Abraham went off, not knowing where he was going, got to Canaan, and God said, now look up into the sky, how many stars can you see? And told him he'd have as many descendants as the stars in the sky. Why didn't God tell Abraham that in the Ur of the Chaldees? I think that he would not have believed him in Ur of the Chaldees. Everything was too familiar. Now he has uprooted him, put him in a new environment where he begins to see things in a fresh way. And he believed God. Jacob was on a journey from Beersheba to Haran when he had a vision of angels ascending and descending between heaven and earth. And he said, surely the Lord is in this place. And Jacob's life was changed through that encounter. But it took place on a journey from his home in Beersheba to Haran. Saul, who became the first king of Israel, was out looking for donkeys that had got lost and went over the hills and far away. And there was a prophet called Samuel who said, there's going to be a man you're going to meet. And this is the man I'm anointing as king. And he saw Saul, and Saul in new territory, in a new environment, meeting a man he didn't know. I suggest you was more open and receptive than he might have been back at home. Ezekiel says that by the rivers of Babylon we sat down, and the heavens were opened, and we saw visions of God. Now the reason why Ezekiel was in Babylon was because the Israelites were in exile, because there were no visions of God back at home. But now they've been taken away to Babylon. They sit by the rivers of Babylon. And he says, as he opens his book, the book of Ezekiel, we had visions of God. God could speak to them. They were in a new position. Why was Jesus baptized in the Jordan River? I know John the Baptist was there, but why not in Galilee? Why not at his hometown of Nazareth? He was in a new area, and people recognized him in a way they probably would not have done at home. Saul, rather than being in Tarsus or Jerusalem, is on his way to Damascus. And often it is this way that God meets with us, when we're out of our normal environment. We're out of what we call our comfort zones, and we're ready to hear and listen in a new way. That's why I spent 15 summers back to back, leading summer camps and conferences, mainly with young people, 12 weeks at a time, right through the summer weeks. They'd come in on Saturday night, go out the next Saturday morning, next group in Saturday night, out the next Saturday morning, 12 weeks for 15 years. And every week we saw people come to Christ. And many of them came from churches or from youth groups where they had heard the gospel many times. But this would be the place where they would come to a catalyst where Christ would come into their lives. And I remember a youth leader, come to me one day and saying, what are we doing wrong at home? And I said, what do you mean? He said, we bring our young people here every summer. He said, but we work with them for 51 weeks of the year. We have a Bible class on a Sunday with them. We have a youth club on a Friday night, and we always have an epilogue, and we present the gospel to them. We meet and pray every Wednesday night, and we hardly ever see anybody come to Christ in the course of those 51 weeks, but we bring them here for a week, and half of them get saved every year. What are we doing wrong? I say, doing nothing wrong at all. Of course, you're sowing seed, etc. But nevertheless, you brought them into a new environment, and everything that they've heard in the last 51 weeks begins to come to them with a fresh force. We have no new message, no different message to what you've been giving them every week. But it's fresh. That's why there'll be many here this morning who came to Christ in camps and conferences. Not because you heard something new there necessarily, but you take out of the normal environment. We live in a routine, and we kind of pigeonhole everything. And God often takes us into a new environment. And again, he does that in Scripture. I think that's why this city of Toronto is a very exciting city. Do you know 49%, the statisticians tell us, of the residents of this city were born outside of Canada? And I'm impressed every time we have a baptism service that there are a number of folks who are baptized who tell us they came here from some other part of the world and it was here they found Christ. Not back home, in a new environment. They heard with fresh ears. And Saul, on his journey to Damascus, that's the moment that God chose to meet with him, when his environment was different. But I said there were three conditions in this profile of a convert. Firstly, his inner condition, his heart was seeking to please God. Secondly, his outer position, he was in a new environment. And thirdly, I want to talk about his future direction. And I want to say what I mean by this, that his future direction was a vital, important ingredient in all of this. Let me read you from verse 3 to verse 6 again of chapter 9. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting," he replied. Listen to this. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." Notice that. You will be told what you must do. You are a man now under authority, under orders. When Paul told his own story later in Jerusalem in Acts 22, he says that he said to Jesus, "What do you want me to do?" In other words, he recognized that this encounter with Christ leads to a submission to Christ as my Lord. And he recognized right from the outset the lordship of Christ in his life. That this encounter was not just about cleaning up his past. Now, often that's our appeal to people to come to Christ, to be forgiven of your past. That's a wonderful thing, but that is not the issue that is central here. The issue is not his past, it's his future. And that is that he's prepared to bring his whole future under the lordship of Christ. And this is what we call discipleship. It is not an additional thing to evangelism. It is the purpose of evangelism. That men and women, boys and girls are brought into a relationship of discipleship where they're asking all the time, "What do you want me to do?" And this is the key issue. And right from the start, Saul knew something of his future. God had told Ananias, "This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel." He knew from his conversion, he had marching orders, instructions. And from the earliest days, Paul had a sense of vocation about his Christian life. He had a sense of vision about his life and his future. You know, we make a very, very big mistake very often by detaching what we call evangelism from what we call discipleship. We detach the act of salvation from the process of sanctification. And by sanctification, the word means to be set apart. Literally, set apart includes not just for holiness of life, but for service to God and being caught up in his purpose and his activities. And these are not separate things. The act of salvation is the beginning of the process of sanctification, being set apart. And salvation is about being reconciled to God that we might live under the lordship of Christ in the enabling and the empowering of the Holy Spirit. And that's what Ananias taught Saul when he 3 days later, for he spent 3 days in Damascus, blind, under conviction, not yet born again of the Spirit, I suggest you. And I say that because in chapter 22 and verse 16, when Saul tells about Ananias coming to him, he said to him, "Be baptized and wash away your sins." His sins hadn't been washed away. And then he taught about receiving the Holy Spirit, that you may be filled with the Holy Spirit. That's here in verse 17, about being filled with the Holy Spirit. So 3 days later, he says, "Saul, you need to be cleansed of your old life and equipped and empowered for a new life in the enabling and the empowering of the Holy Spirit." May I mention something I've mentioned before, but I'll mention it again because it stands out to me as I ask of these kind of stories, how are they different to what we're doing today and what we're saying today? It intrigues me that in this instance, as in all the examples of conversion in the book of Acts, going to heaven was never even talked about. Heaven is a wonderful prospect for us. We know that. But that is not the reason to become a Christian in the New Testament. It is a consequence, but the reason is to be reconciled to God, indwelt by His Spirit, and equipped to live life in such a way that we fulfill the purpose we were created for and we bring pleasure to God. And at the end of it, there's going to be heaven. But sometimes we muddy the waters by making it the main issue. And every Tom, Dick, and Harry, with every sense, common sense, will want to go to heaven when they die. But they do not want to be disciples of Jesus. And that's the issue. Whether we are to be disciples of the Lord Jesus, allowing Him to reign as Lord in our lives. And that's why some of us stagnate, because we don't ask the question that Saul asked on the day he met with Christ. What do you want me to do? Not as a once-for-all question, but a day-by-day question. What is your plan? What is your will? I trust you to guide me, to lead me, to enable me, to empower me to fulfill your purpose and to live in the good of that relationship where He's Lord and He's King. And there are a number of folks who've never settled that issue. And you wonder why your Christian life is so often dry, where there's not the excitement and joy in knowing God that other people seem to have. I suggest that 2 of these 3 criteria run right through every individual conversion, or should do. There's the inward condition, the attitude of heart. There's the seeking after God, the desire to know Him, the desire to be in relationship with Him, the desire to please Him. And if you're here this morning or you're listening on television and you know there is that hunger in your heart, I've got wonderful news for you. Jesus said, I've come to seek and to save that which was lost. If you're seeking for Christ and He's seeking for you, it won't take you long to connect. And you can say, Lord, you're looking for me and I'm looking for you. Please, today, will you bring me into that living relationship with yourself? And He will. And we believe He's already done that this morning in this building and brought people into that living relationship. The other factor that in common right across every genuine Christian conversion is not just the inward condition of heart, but the forward direction that we now are concerned about, that we're living under the Lordship of Christ. And if you find your Christian life is stagnating, would you come back to this point and say, Lord, what will you have me to do? I want to surrender every part of my life to your authority and your enabling by your Holy Spirit. And often the third one is true as well. It's not always, but the outward position where God changes our circumstances, where He changes our comfort areas. Maybe you're not in a different place physically this morning, but things have been happening in your life that have churned you up. You often look back and see that as being a catalyst for God in a new way in your life. Because as things change, as we get maybe churned up by our environment or our circumstances, we begin to ask questions we didn't ask before, and we begin to call out to God in ways we didn't do so before. And maybe God has brought you to that point. He's troubling the waters of your life in order that you look for God in a fresh way and be receptive to Him in a fresh way. If you don't know Christ as Lord in your life, or you say, well, I've learned all the language and I'm here again this morning, but there's no sense of life and spiritual vitality, which we long to see, because that is what will bring revival, and that alone, into this church and this area, when we know God, not just about Him, just believe in Him somewhere, but we know Him and we experience Him and we love Him and He's real in our lives. And maybe this morning you need to say, Lord, I am a Christian, but I feel very dry and distant, and I want to begin to seek for you. You will find me, said God to Jeremiah, when you seek me with all your heart. You say, Lord, give me that appetite. Give me a hunger to know you beyond everything else. And he will. And bring you into the joy of a salvation that is full and liberating and empowering